Millionaire leaves safe unlocked to test the maid. But her reaction moved him. Richard William Thompson watched through the security cameras of his office on the 20th floor of the commercial building in New York City. His fortune had been built over decades in the real estate business, but distrust had always followed him. He had never been able to fully trust anyone, especially after so many betrayals in the world of business. That morning, he had intentionally left the safe in his private office slightly ajar. Mrs. Margaret, the maid who had been cleaning the place for 3 months, would arrive in a few minutes for the weekly cleaning. Richard wanted to test her honesty once and for all, because something about her bothered him. She was different from the other employees he had hired. Margaret Rose Williams arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, as she always did. At 52, her face bore the marks of a life of hard work, but her eyes still shone with a kindness that few could maintain after so many hardships. She greeted the doorman with a genuine smile and went up to the office with her cleaning supplies. Upon entering the room, Margaret began her usual routine, first vacuuming the carpet, then dusting the shelves, and finally organizing the desk. It was then that her eyes turned to the right corner of the room, and she froze completely. The safe was open, displaying stacks of cash and some jewelry gleaming under the artificial light. Margaret let the mop slip from her hands, her heart racing. She looked around, checking if anyone was nearby. The office was utterly silent. Her legs trembled slightly as she slowly approached the safe, as if it were a mirage that might disappear at any moment. Inside, she saw more money than she had ever imagined existed. Bundles and bundles of $100 bills, carefully arranged in rows. Beside them, velvet boxes held rings, necklaces, and earrings worth more than she would earn in an entire lifetime of work. For a moment, Margaret thought of her 3 nephews, whom she had raised alone since her sister Catherine passed away 5 years ago. She thought of the overdue bills, the expensive medicine Johnny, the youngest, needed for his asthma, the nearly empty refrigerator at home. A single one of those bills would solve all her problems for months. But then, as if hearing her mother's voice echoing in her mind, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. She knelt right there in front of the open safe and began to pray fervently. Tears streamed down her face as she asked for strength to resist temptation and gave thanks for everything she had, even if it was so little. Richard, watching everything through the cameras, felt something strange stir in his chest. He had never seen a reaction like that. Other maids would have taken at least a few bills, justifying that no one would miss them, but Margaret was there praying as if it were a sacred moment. After a few minutes, Margaret stood up, wiped her tears, and carefully closed the safe. She turned the combination until it locked completely, as if protecting something precious. Then she picked up her mop and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. For the next 3 days, Richard couldn't get that scene out of his head. He watched Margaret work and noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. How she handled every object with care, how she cleaned corners no one would see, how she always left a note thanking him for the opportunity to work there. On Thursday, Richard decided he needed to talk to her. He arrived at the office early and waited for Margaret to arrive. When she entered, she was surprised to find him there. "Good morning, Mr. Richard." "I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd be here today," Margaret said, lowering her head respectfully. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something important," Richard said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Margaret's heart raced. Had he discovered the safe? Had the cameras seen her? She knew many employers didn't trust the honesty of maids like her. "Of course, Mr. Richard. Did I do something wrong?" she asked, trying to control her nerves. "On Monday, did you notice anything unusual in this office?" Richard asked, studying every expression on her face. Margaret took a deep breath. Her mother had always taught her that the truth, even when painful, was always the best path. "I saw the safe was open, Mr. Richard. I was worried about your security, so I closed it properly before leaving," she replied, looking straight into his eyes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, back to the story. Richard remained silent for a long moment. The simplicity and honesty of her answer completely disarmed him. There were no lies, no elaborate excuses, just the plain truth. "Margaret, "Did you see what was inside the safe?" He continued probing. "Yes, sir. A lot of money and some beautiful jewelry. That's why I closed it quickly so no one would touch what's yours," she answered, still holding his gaze. "And you didn't feel tempted to take anything? Not even a small bill?" Richard pressed, needing to understand. Margaret smiled sadly. "Mr. Richard, my mother raised me to believe that if something isn't ours, we shouldn't even touch it. It could be falling from the sky, but if it's not mine, it's not mine. I'd rather struggle with dignity than live well with a guilty conscience." "But are you struggling, Margaret?" Richard asked, feeling a tightness in his chest. "Everyone struggles a little, Mr. Richard, but as long as I have my health to work and my honesty to sleep in peace, I'm all right," Margaret replied, smoothing her uniform. At that moment, Richard realized he needed to know more about this extraordinary woman's life. Over the following weeks, he began asking subtle questions and discovered that Margaret was raising her sister's 3 children alone: Johnny, age 10, Mary, 12, and Peter, 14. Margaret had been married once, but her husband abandoned her when he found out she couldn't have children. After that, she devoted her life to caring for her younger sister, Catherine, who had gotten pregnant very young and been left alone. When Catherine passed suddenly from pneumonia that had worsened, Margaret took responsibility for the 3 children without hesitation. Richard learned that Margaret walked an hour and a half every day to save on bus fare, that she ate only 2 meals a day, so there would be more food for her nieces and nephews, that she worked in 3 different homes besides cleaning the office and still barely managed to pay all the bills. Moved by her situation, Richard decided to raise Margaret's salary. He called her in to talk on a Monday and told her he was doubling her pay. "Mr. Richard, I don't understand. Did I do something special to deserve this?" Margaret asked, confused. "Everything you do is special, Margaret. Your work is impeccable, and your honesty is rare these days," Richard explained. Margaret began to cry right then. "Thank you, Mr. Richard. You can't imagine how much this will help. Johnny needs medicine every month, and now we'll be able to buy it on time," she said through tears of gratitude. In the months that followed, Richard noticed something that surprised him again. Even with the raise, Margaret kept walking to save on bus fare. When he discreetly looked into it, he discovered she was sharing part of the increase with other struggling families in her neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City. There was Mrs. Martha, an 80-year-old neighbor with no family to help her. Mr. Jack, a retiree who split his diabetes medication with his wife because he couldn't afford to buy 2. The family of John Baptist, who had lost his job and was struggling to feed his 4 young children. Richard learned that Margaret was organizing a kind of support network in the neighborhood. She collected used clothes, redistributed food, and even taught children to read and write when she got back from work. All of it completely naturally, as if it were her duty to care for those around her. Richard's wife, Victoria, began noticing changes in her husband's behavior. He constantly talked about Margaret, praised her dedication, and even suggested she could work at the family mansion in Beverly Hills. "Richard, you're obsessed with this maid. That's not normal," Victoria remarked during an elegant dinner at their home. "It's not obsession, Victoria. It's admiration for someone with real values," Richard replied, pouring himself some wine. "Values? She's a maid, Richard. Don't confuse poverty with virtue," Victoria retorted disdainfully. "And don't confuse wealth with superiority," Richard shot back, a remark that left Victoria fuming. Victoria had married Richard 30 years earlier, when he was still building his empire. She came from a traditional New York City family that had lost its money but held on to its social status. Their marriage had been more of a convenient arrangement than true love, and over the years they'd grown accustomed to a formal, distant relationship. Feeling threatened by Richard's admiration for Margaret, Victoria decided to take action. She discreetly hired a private investigator to look into the maid's past, searching for anything she could use against her. Meanwhile, Margaret carried on with her routine, unaware of the investigation. One morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual because Johnny had fallen ill during the night, and she'd had to take him to the health clinic. The boy had suffered a severe asthma attack and needed medical attention. Richard arrived shortly after and found Margaret cleaning the windows more slowly than usual. "Margaret, are you all right? You look tired." Richard observed. "I'm fine, Mr. Richard. Johnny had a rough night, but he's better now," she replied, trying to mask her worry. "Johnny's the youngest, right? What happened to him?" Richard asked, genuinely concerned. Margaret hesitated before answering. She didn't like bothering her employers with personal problems. "His asthma is getting worse. The doctor said he needs some tests, but they're a bit expensive. I'll manage to save up little by little," she explained, returning to the windows. "How much do the tests cost?" Richard asked directly. "Mr. Richard, please don't worry about it. I'll figure it out," Margaret replied quickly. "Margaret, how much?" Richard insisted, more firmly this time. $800, but I'll pay in installments," Margaret admitted, lowering her head. Richard fell silent. $800 was what he spent on a single meal at some of the restaurants he frequented. For Margaret, it represented over a month of hard work. "Margaret, I'll pay for those tests. Consider it an advance on your salary," Richard said decisively. "No, Mr. Richard, I can't accept. You already pay me very well." Margaret refused, shaking her head. "It's not a favor, Margaret, it's a loan. You can deduct it from your paycheck little by little," Richard insisted. After much hesitation, Margaret agreed. In the following days, she took Johnny for all the necessary tests. The diagnosis showed the boy would need follow-up with a specialist and some pricier medications, but nothing that couldn't be properly treated. A week later, Margaret arrived at the office carrying a bag. "Mr. Richard, I brought something for you," she said timidly. Inside the bag was a homemade chocolate cake, still warm. "Johnny insisted on helping make it. He wanted to thank you for helping with the tests," Margaret explained, smiling. Richard was moved. It had been decades since anyone had offered him something made with their own hands, something that came from the heart and not from the shelves of expensive stores. "Tell Johnny I love the gift. It's been a long time since I received something so special," Richard said, carefully putting the cake away. That afternoon, Richard ate the cake in his office and tasted a flavor he hadn't experienced since childhood. It wasn't the most refined flavor he'd ever had, but it was the most genuine. Meanwhile, the detective hired by Victoria had uncovered surprising information about Margaret. The report revealed that she had been a university literature professor for 15 years, graduating from Columbia University with a master's in education. Margaret had been a respected professional with a promising academic career. She had published articles in specialized journals and even received invitations to teach at prestigious private universities. Her life had changed completely when Catherine was diagnosed with lupus 10 years ago. To care for her sick sister and young nephews, Margaret had resigned from the university and sold everything she owned to pay for medical treatments. She worked as a private tutor for a few years, but when Catherine's condition worsened, she needed jobs with more flexible hours. The report also revealed that Margaret had been betrayed by her husband right when she was caring for her sister. He abandoned her, taking all their savings and leaving her with nothing but responsibilities and medical debts. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Victoria read the report with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was pleased to discover that Margaret wasn't just an uneducated maid, which explained why Richard admired her so much. On the other hand, she realized this made Margaret even more dangerous, an educated woman, beautiful despite her age and hardships, with a story of sacrifice that would touch anyone's heart. Determined to remove Margaret from Richard's life, Victoria devised a plan. During a social gathering at her home, she casually mentioned to some friends about her husband's special maid, planting seeds of doubt and implying that Richard was being naive. "You know how men get when they feel like heroes, right?" Victoria remarked to her friends. "He thinks he's found a saint, but I'm sure this woman is taking advantage of his kindness." One of her friends, Veronica, suggested a wicked idea. "Why don't you test her too? If she's as honest as she seems, she'll resist any temptation." Victoria liked the suggestion. The following week, when Richard traveled to Washington, D.C. for business, she put her plan into action. She arrived at the office at the time she knew Margaret would be cleaning and pretended there was an emergency. "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. I need to get some important documents of Richard's, but I forgot the safe combination," Victoria lied. "Should I call him, Mrs. Victoria?" Margaret offered. "No, no need to bother him. He told me you knew how to open the safe," Victoria continued lying. Margaret was confused. Richard had never given her the safe combination, and she didn't understand why Victoria was saying this. "Mrs. Victoria, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't know the combination. Mr. Richard never mentioned anything about it," Margaret clarified politely. "Oh, how strange." "He said he trusted you with these things," Victoria insisted, trying to get Margaret to open the safe somehow. "If you'd like, I can call him right now to confirm," Margaret offered again. Frustrated by her inability to persuade Margaret, Victoria changed tactics. She pretended to receive an urgent call and said she needed to leave quickly, leaving her designer bag forgotten on the table. Inside the bag, Victoria had placed an expensive diamond ring and a gold watch, positioned so they would be visible when the bag was opened. Her plan was to return later and accuse Margaret of theft. Margaret continued her cleaning as usual. When she finished vacuuming the carpet, she noticed the forgotten bag. Concerned about the security of the belongings, she carefully closed the bag and placed it inside a desk drawer, leaving a note explaining where it was stored. 2 hours later, Victoria returned to the office with 2 friends as witnesses, feigning desperation. "My bag! Where's my bag?" she cried theatrically. "It's in the desk drawer, Mrs. Victoria. I left a note explaining," Margaret replied calmly, going to retrieve the bag. Victoria opened the bag in front of her friends and pretended to check its contents. "My ring! Where's my diamond ring?" she exclaimed, staring directly at Margaret. Margaret was shocked by the accusation. "Mrs. Victoria, I didn't touch anything in your bag. I only put it in the drawer to keep it safe," she defended herself. "And my gold watch? It's gone too." Victoria continued her act. Victoria's friends eyed Margaret with suspicion, just as she had planned. "Please, let me check my own bag to prove I didn't take anything," Margaret offered, reaching for her simple cloth purse. When she opened it, Margaret turned pale. There, inside, were the ring and watch Victoria claimed were missing. I don't know how these got here," Margaret stammered, bewildered. "You don't know? How convenient," Victoria said with false outrage. Margaret began to tremble. She had never been in such a situation before, and the injustice left her completely shaken. "Mrs. Victoria, I swear on my sister's soul, I didn't take these things. Someone must have put them in my bag," Margaret said, tears welling up. "Someone? Who? You were the only one here," Victoria accused. One of Victoria's friends suggested calling building security, but Margaret pleaded, "Please, don't call anyone. I'll leave right now and never come back. Just don't ruin my reputation. I need to work to support my nephews." Victoria was savoring her victory when Richard unexpectedly arrived. He had decided to return early from his trip because he closed the deal sooner than expected. "What's going on here?" Richard asked, sensing the tension in the room. "Richard, you're just in time. Your model employee was caught stealing my jewelry," Victoria announced dramatically. Richard looked at Margaret, who stood with her head down, still trembling, tears in her eyes. "Margaret, is this true?" Richard asked directly. Margaret raised her reddened eyes and looked at him with deep sorrow. "Mr. Richard, I've never in my life taken anything that wasn't mine. Someone put these things in my bag, but I don't know who," she answered, her voice breaking. Richard had known Margaret for months and had never seen any sign of dishonesty in her. This was the same woman who had resisted the temptation of millions in an open safe. She would never steal jewelry from a bag. "Victoria, where did you leave your bag?" Richard asked his wife. "On the table, like I always do," Victoria replied. "And Margaret, did you see Victoria's bag?" Richard continued his inquiry. "Yes, Mr. Richard. Mrs. Victoria rushed out and left her bag open on the table. I closed it and put it in the drawer so it wouldn't be at risk of theft," Margaret explained. "Was the purse open when you found it?" Richard insisted. "It was. That's why I closed it and put it away," Margaret confirmed. Richard began piecing together the puzzle. He had known Victoria for decades and knew she was extremely careful with her expensive belongings. He had never seen her leave a purse open, let alone forget valuable jewelry in plain sight. "Victoria, why did you leave your purse open with valuable jewelry visible?" Richard asked, changing his tone. I was in a hurry, I wasn't paying attention, Victoria stammered, realizing her husband was growing suspicious. And why did you come back here after 2 hours? Richard continued. To get the purse, of course, Victoria replied, starting to get nervous. But you never forget your things. In 30 years of marriage, I've never seen you leave without your purse, Richard observed. Victoria realized her plan was backfiring. The friends she had brought as witnesses began to look at her strangely. Richard, I don't understand why you're interrogating me instead of confronting the thief. Victoria tried to turn the tables. Because this thief is the same woman who prayed in front of an open safe with millions of dollars and didn't touch a thing, Richard revealed, leaving everyone shocked. Margaret looked at Richard with admiration. He believed in her despite the planted evidence. Victoria, I'll check the security cameras. If Margaret really stole your jewelry, the footage will show it, Richard announced. Victoria's face paled. She hadn't thought about the security cameras because she was so focused on setting up the situation. There's no need to check anything, Richard. Maybe I was mistaken, Victoria said quickly. Mistaken how? Richard pressed. Maybe the jewelry accidentally fell into Margaret's purse. Victoria offered a weak excuse. Fell? A ring and a watch fell from your purse into Margaret's? Richard questioned, visibly angry. Victoria's friends exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something embarrassing. Victoria, you set this up, didn't you? Richard accused directly. Richard, you're being ridiculous. Why would I do such a thing? Victoria tried to defend herself. Because you're jealous of the admiration I have for Margaret. Because you can't stand someone having better character than you, Richard replied, his voice filled with disappointment. Silence fell over the room. Margaret kept her head down, unsure how to react. Victoria's friends quickly said their goodbyes, embarrassed to have been part of the charade. When they were alone, Richard turned to Margaret. Margaret, I apologize for what my wife did. You didn't deserve this. Mr. Richard, maybe it's best if I don't work here anymore. I don't want to be the reason for trouble between you, Margaret said sadly. No, Margaret. You're not leaving because of this. Victoria is the one who needs to explain herself, Richard said firmly. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Thompson household became unbearable. Victoria refused to admit she had orchestrated the situation, sticking to an inconsistent version of events. Richard, meanwhile, could no longer look at his wife the same way. Margaret continued working in the office, but now carried a heavy heart. She knew her presence was causing problems in her employer's marriage, and it deeply troubled her. A week after the incident, Richard made a decision. He called Margaret for a serious talk. Margaret, I want you to know I trust you completely. What Victoria did was unforgivable, Richard said. Thank you for believing in me, Mr. Richard. That means so much, Margaret replied emotionally. But I need to tell you something I found out about you, Richard continued. I know you were a university professor. I know about your sister. I know about the sacrifices you've made. Margaret was surprised. She had never told her full story to Richard. How did you find out? She asked. Victoria hired a detective to investigate you. When I read the report, I understood why you are the person you are, Richard explained. Margaret felt a mix of embarrassment and sadness. Mr. Richard, I never hid anything. I just don't think it's important to keep talking about the past, she said. Important? Margaret, you gave up a brilliant career to take care of your family. You sacrificed everything you had to give your nephews a better life. That's not just important, it's heroic, Richard said with genuine admiration. It wasn't heroism, Mr. Richard. It was love. You do what you have to do for the people you love, Margaret replied simply. In that moment, Richard realized Margaret had taught him more about values in a few months than he had learned in decades of life. Her simplicity carried a wisdom no university could teach. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the following weeks, Richard began to completely reevaluate his life. He noticed how Victoria treated the household staff, how she wasted food while complaining about expenses, how indifferent she was to others' suffering. Margaret, on the other hand, transformed every space she entered. The building's security guards adored her because she always greeted them warmly. The other cleaners came to her for advice about personal problems. Even the grumpiest doorman smiled when she arrived. One day, Richard decided to visit the neighborhood where Margaret lived. He wanted to meet the nephews she often spoke about and understand their family's reality better. The house was simple, but impeccably clean and organized. Johnny, Mary, and Peter welcomed Richard with a politeness and warmth that surprised him. Despite their poverty, they were happy children, studied diligently, and spoke of Aunt Margaret with an admiration that touched Richard's heart. "Are you Aunt Margaret's boss?" asked Mary, the 12-year-old girl. "Yes, I am, and you're the special nephew she talks about so much," Richard replied, smiling. "Aunt Margaret always says you're very good to her. She prays for you every night," said Johnny, the youngest. Richard was moved to learn Margaret included him in her daily prayers. "And how are you all doing in school?" Richard asked. "I want to be a teacher, like Aunt Margaret was before," Mary said, her eyes shining. "And I want to be a doctor to take care of kids like me who have asthma," Johnny added. Peter, the oldest, was quieter. Richard noticed and asked, "What about you, Peter? What do you want to be when you grow up?" "I want to make a lot of money so Aunt Margaret doesn't have to work so hard," the boy answered seriously. That response broke Richard's heart. A 14-year-old boy carrying the weight of supporting his family in the future. "Peter, your aunt works because she loves what she does, not just out of necessity," Richard tried to explain. "I know, Mr. Richard, but she gets so tired. Sometimes I hear her crying when she thinks we're asleep," Peter confided. Richard returned home with a heavy heart. He could no longer accept living in a mansion with dozens of empty rooms, while Margaret and her nephews squeezed into 2 rooms on the outskirts. He could no longer tolerate the waste and superficiality that dominated his life. That night, he had a final conversation with Victoria. "Victoria, our marriage ended long ago. We've just been pretending we're still a couple," Richard said during dinner. "Richard, you're talking nonsense. Every marriage goes through rough patches," Victoria replied, trying to downplay it. "It's not a rough patch, Victoria. We're completely different people." "We want different things in life," Richard insisted. "Is this because of that maid, isn't it?" Victoria accused. "It's because of me. Margaret just showed me who I really am beneath all this wealth," Richard explained. "And who are you, Richard?" Victoria asked sarcastically. "Someone who wants to make a difference in people's lives. Someone who wants to use wealth to help, not to show off," Richard replied firmly. "You've lost your mind. I won't accept a divorce," Victoria declared. "Then we'll live apart. You can keep the house. I'll move to the downtown apartment," Richard decided. The following Monday, Richard told Margaret about his decision. She was worried, thinking she was to blame for the separation. "Mr. Richard, I never meant to interfere in your marriage. Maybe it's best if I look for another job," Margaret suggested. "Margaret, you didn't interfere at all. You just helped me see the truth. Victoria and I haven't been happy for years," Richard reassured her. "Still, I feel awful for being the reason you argued," Margaret insisted. "You weren't the reason, you were the inspiration. There's a big difference," Richard corrected. In the following months, Richard moved to a smaller apartment downtown. It was simple, but enough for his needs. Victoria kept the mansion and carried on with her social life as if nothing had changed. Richard began to see Margaret not just as a maid, but as a friend and advisor. She helped him redecorate the apartment with simplicity and good taste, always spending as little as possible. "Mr. Richard, a home doesn't need to be expensive to be beautiful. It needs love," Margaret would say while arranging the furniture. One day, Richard got a call that would change everything. It was from the hospital in Margaret's neighborhood. Johnny had suffered a severe asthma attack and had been admitted. Richard rushed to the hospital and found Margaret in despair in the emergency hallway. She was pale and trembling with fear. "Margaret, how is he?" Richard asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The doctors won't say much. They say it's serious and that he needs to stay in the ICU," Margaret replied through tears. "He'll be okay, Margaret. Johnny is strong," Richard tried to comfort her. Richard, I don't have the money for a private ICU. Medicare has a waiting list and I don't know what to do," Margaret broke down. "Margaret, don't worry about money. I'll transfer Johnny to the best hospital in the city right now," Richard decided immediately. "No, Mr. Richard, you've already helped me too much. I can't accept this," Margaret protested. "Margaret, if it were your child, you'd do anything to save him, wouldn't you?" Richard asked. "Of course I would," Margaret answered. "Then let me do the same. Johnny is special to me too," Richard said tenderly. Within hours, Johnny was transferred to a top private hospital. The best pediatric pulmonologists in New York City cared for the boy, who responded well to intensive treatment. For the 5 days Johnny was hospitalized, Margaret never left the hospital. She slept in a chair beside her nephew's bed and refused to go home to rest. Richard visited every day and always found Margaret in the same spot, watching over the boy's sleep. "Margaret, you need to rest. You won't help Johnny if you get sick too," Richard advised. "I'll be fine, Mr. Richard. I'll only leave when I know he's out of danger," Margaret replied with determination. On the 3rd night, Richard found Margaret crying alone in the hospital hallway. She thought no one saw her and let the tears fall freely. "Margaret, what's wrong? Did Johnny get worse?" Richard asked worriedly. "No, Mr. Richard, Johnny is doing better. It's just me," Margaret began but couldn't finish. "What is it, Margaret?" Richard pressed, sitting beside her. "I'm scared, Mr. Richard. Scared of losing him like I lost Catherine. Fear of not being able to take proper care of the children. Fear of failing them," Margaret confessed between sobs. Richard stayed silent for a moment, feeling the deep pain of this woman who carried so much weight on her shoulders. "Margaret, you're the bravest person I know. Those children are so lucky to have you," he said sincerely. "Sometimes I don't feel brave. Sometimes I feel so tired and alone," Margaret admitted. "You're not alone, Margaret. You can always count on me," Richard promised. That night, Richard stayed at the hospital, keeping Margaret company. They talked until dawn about life, about dreams lost and found, about the meaning of family and love. On the 5th day, Johnny was discharged. The doctor said that with the right treatment, he could live a normal life. Margaret cried with relief in her nephew's arms. "Aunt Margaret, why are you crying? I'm fine now," Johnny asked innocently. "These are tears of happiness, my love. Auntie is happy because you're going to be okay," Margaret explained, wiping her eyes. "Did Mr. Richard stay here with you too?" Johnny asked. "Yes, he did. He likes you very much," Margaret replied, looking gratefully at Richard. "Can he be our pretend uncle?" Johnny asked, making Margaret and Richard laugh. "If he wants to, then yes," Margaret answered, still smiling. "Of course I want to. It'd be an honor to be your pretend uncle." Richard accepted the invitation with joy. In the following months, Richard became a constant presence in Margaret's family life, not as a boss, but as a true friend. He helped Peter get an internship at a company, paid for Mary's tutoring, and made sure Johnny always had the necessary medication. Margaret, initially resistant to so much help, eventually accepted it because she realized Richard found happiness in being able to do good. "Mr. Richard, you don't have to do so much for us," Margaret would always say. "Margaret, you've given me something I never had, a real family. Let me give back a little," Richard would reply. One day, Richard had an idea that would completely change the course of their story. He called Margaret for a special conversation in his apartment. "Margaret, I have a proposal for you," Richard began. "What kind of proposal, Mr. Richard?" Margaret asked curiously. "I want you to become a teacher again," Richard announced. Margaret fell silent, processing what she had just heard. "Mr. Richard, that's in the past. Now I'm a housekeeper, and that's okay," Margaret replied. "It's not in the past, Margaret. You were born to teach. I've seen how you explain things to your nephews, how the other housekeepers in the building ask for your advice. You have the gift," Richard insisted. "But how? It's been years since I left that field. I don't have any connections anymore. I don't even know if anyone remembers me," Margaret argued. "Margaret, I want to fund a school for underprivileged children in your neighborhood. And I want you to be the principal," Richard revealed his plan. Margaret was stunned. It was a dream she didn't even know she still carried in her heart. "Mr. Richard, that's impossible. A school costs so much money," Margaret tried to be realistic. "Margaret, I have enough money to build several schools. What I didn't have was the right person to run one. Now I've found her," Richard explained. "But I don't know anything about school administration," Margaret protested. "You'll learn. You learn to be a mother to 3 children overnight. You learn to manage a household with almost no money. You'll learn to run a school too, Richard encouraged. Margaret began to cry. It was a dream she had buried long ago and that now resurfaced with full force. Mr. Richard, what if I fail? What if I disappoint the children? Margaret voiced her fears. Margaret, you've never disappointed anyone in your life. You won't start now, Richard assured her. In the following months, Richard and Margaret worked together on the school project. They visited lots, spoke with architects, planned the curriculum. Margaret blossomed each day, rediscovering her passion for education. The chosen lot was in the heart of Margaret's neighborhood, a spacious area with old trees that would provide natural shade for the children to play. Mr. Richard, here the children will be able to study and play at the same time. It's perfect, Margaret said the day they first visited the lot. Margaret, you were the one who chose it. I just approved, Richard replied, happy to see her so excited. During the school's construction, something unexpected happened. Victoria showed up at Richard's apartment asking to talk. Richard, I need to speak with you about something important, Victoria said, visibly uncomfortable. What is it, Victoria? Richard asked, surprised by her visit. I want to apologize for what I did to Margaret, Victoria began haltingly. Richard was stunned. Victoria had never admitted to setting up the jewelry incident. What made you change your mind? Richard asked. My sister told me about the school project. She said you and Margaret are creating something beautiful for underprivileged children, Victoria explained. And? Richard didn't see the connection. Richard, I realize now that Margaret truly is special. She could have used her influence over you for personal gain, but she's using it to help others, Victoria admitted. Margaret has always been like that, Victoria. You just refuse to see it, Richard replied. I know. I was jealous, afraid of losing you. But now I understand I lost you a long time ago, Victoria confessed. Victoria, it wasn't Margaret who destroyed our marriage. We did that ourselves over the years, Richard clarified. I know. That's why I want to do something to make amends. I want to help with the school, Victoria offered. Richard was genuinely surprised. Help how? He asked. I have connections in education. I can get qualified teachers, materials, equipment. I know you don't need my money, but I can offer my network, Victoria explained. Why would you do this? Richard wanted to understand her motives. Because I want to look in the mirror and not feel ashamed. Because I want our children to be proud of who I am, Victoria answered. Richard and Victoria had no children, but he understood she meant the children they might have had, the dreams they never fulfilled together. I'll talk to Margaret. If she accepts your help, you're welcome, Richard decided. When Richard told Margaret about Victoria's offer, she was thoughtful for a long time. What do you think, Margaret? Richard asked. I think everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Richard. If she truly wants to help, we'll accept, Margaret decided with her characteristic generosity. Are you sure? After everything she did to you, Richard pressed. Mr. Richard, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't do anyone any good, Margaret reflected. The school's construction became a community project. Victoria kept her promises, securing donations of materials and equipment. Other families in the neighborhood volunteered their time. The atmosphere of hope and unity spread throughout the community. Margaret worked tirelessly, planning every detail of the school. She wanted it to be a place where children felt loved and respected, no matter their background. Mr. Richard, I want our school to be different. I want the children to learn not just subjects, but values, Margaret explained her vision. What kind of values? Richard asked, intrigued. I want to teach honesty, solidarity, respect. I want them to know they can be anything, no matter where they come from, Margaret elaborated. Margaret, you're going to change these children's lives, Richard said admiringly. We'll change them together, Mr. Richard. You, me, and everyone who's helping, Margaret corrected, always sharing credit. 6 months later, Catherine Academy was ready. Margaret had chosen the name to honor her sister, and Richard thought it was perfect. The school had spacious classrooms, a library, a computer lab, a sports court, and a garden where children could learn about nature. On inauguration day, hundreds of people from the neighborhood attended. Kids ran through the new hallways, parents cried with emotion, and teachers introduced themselves eagerly. Richard watched from a corner, his heart full of joy. Margaret was at the center of it all, greeting every family, explaining the educational project, radiating happiness. "Mr. Richard, aren't you going to give a speech?" Margaret asked when she noticed him standing aside. "No, Margaret. Today is your day. You should be the one to speak," Richard replied. Margaret stepped onto a small makeshift platform and addressed the community. "Friends, this school isn't mine. It's ours. It belongs to every child who will study here, every parent who trusted our work, every person who helped build this dream." The audience applauded, moved. "I want to tell you how it all began," Margaret continued. "One day, my boss left a safe open to test me. He wanted to know if I was honest. Today, I realized the one being tested wasn't me, it was him. God was testing whether he would use his wealth for good or for evil." She looked at Richard, who stood emotional in the crowd. "And he passed with flying colors, because he chose to use his fortune to give our children opportunities. Because he understood that true wealth isn't in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we share with others." The applause was deafening. Tears streamed down Richard's face. He had never felt so fulfilled in his life. After the speeches, Margaret approached him. "Mr. Richard, thank you for believing in me from the very first day," she said, her eyes shining. "Margaret, thank you for showing me who I could truly be," Richard replied. "And now what happens next?" Margaret asked. "Now we'll make this school the best in the country. We'll prove that quality education can reach even the poorest children," Richard said with determination. In the following years, Catherine Academy became a national model. Neighborhood children who once had no future prospects began dreaming of college. Peter, Margaret's oldest nephew, was the first graduate and earned a scholarship to study engineering. Johnny, who had nearly lost his life to asthma, became one of the school's top students and dreamed of becoming a pediatrician. Mary discovered her talent for art and talked of studying fine arts. Margaret found complete fulfillment as an educator. She developed innovative teaching methods, trained other teachers, and became a reference for education in underserved communities. Richard discovered his true calling in education. He opened several more schools across the country, always with Margaret as his chief advisor. He learned that doing good was far more rewarding than just accumulating wealth. Victoria also transformed. She dedicated herself to social work and discovered a passion for child psychology. She returned to school and specialized in helping traumatized children. One day, 5 years after the school's opening, Richard and Margaret were walking through the courtyard when he stopped and said, "Margaret, I want to tell you something I've never told anyone." "What is it, Mr. Richard?" Margaret asked curiously. "That day with the open safe wasn't the first time I tested a maid," Richard confessed. Margaret was surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Over the years, I've tested many employees the same way. They all took money. Some a little, others a lot, but they all took some," Richard revealed. "And why did you test me then?" Margaret wanted to know. "Because there was something different about you. The way you cleaned, how you treated people, how you spoke about your nephews. I needed to know if my intuition was right," Richard explained. "And was it?" Margaret asked with a smile. "It was more than right. You didn't just pass the test, you completely changed my life," Richard replied. "Mr. Richard, can I confess something too?" Margaret said timidly. "Of course, Margaret," Richard encouraged. "That day, when I saw the safe open, I did think about taking a bill," Margaret admitted. Richard was surprised. "You did?" he asked. "I did. For a few seconds, I thought about how much it could help my nephews. But then I remembered my mother's voice saying God always sees everything we do, even when no one is watching," Margaret explained. "And that's why you prayed?" Richard asked. "I prayed for strength to do the right thing and thanked God for giving me honest work," Margaret answered. "Margaret, that only proves you're even more special than I thought. Even your moments of weakness are noble," Richard said with admiration. At that moment, they were interrupted by a group of children leaving their computer class. "Aunt Margaret! Uncle Richard!" the children shouted, running to hug them. "Aunt Margaret, today I learned to write my name on the computer," said a 6-year-old girl. "And I learned how to do division," added an 8-year-old boy. Margaret and Richard exchanged a glance and smiled. Those children were the real treasure they had found. "Kids, do you know why this school exists?" Margaret asked, kneeling to their height. "Because Uncle Richard is rich," one child answered. "Not just because of that," Margaret gently corrected. "It exists because so many people believed you deserve the best education can offer. And because Aunt Margaret is the best teacher in the world," another child shouted. "And you're the best students in the world," Margaret replied, hugging all the children. Richard watched the scene with his heart overflowing with happiness. He had discovered that true wealth wasn't in safes full of money, but in those children's smiles, in their families' gratitude, in the transformation of an entire community. "Mr. Richard, sometimes I think it was God who let you forget to close that safe," Margaret remarked as the children walked away. "Why do you say that?" Richard asked. "Because if it weren't for that test, you would have never met my family, and we would have never met you, and this school would have never existed," Margaret mused. "Margaret, you're right. But it wasn't God who left the safe open. It was me, testing you," Richard reminded her. "Ah, but who gave you the idea to test me on that exact day?" Margaret questioned with a mysterious smile. Richard grew thoughtful. He had never really considered what prompted him to test Margaret specifically. "You know what, Margaret, you're right. Maybe it was part of a bigger plan than our minds can understand," Richard agreed. "It always is, Mr. Richard. It always is," Margaret replied, gazing at the blue afternoon sky. Years later, when Catherine Academy had graduated hundreds of students and become a model for schools across the country, Margaret and Richard were still working together, she as an educator, he as a benefactor and visionary for new projects. The school had become more than an educational institution. It was a community center where families found support, where young people discovered their talents, where dreams became reality. Peter, Margaret's eldest nephew, had graduated with a degree in engineering and returned to help expand the schools. Johnny had earned a scholarship in medicine and was specializing in pediatric pulmonology. Mary had graduated in arts and created an art therapy program for children in the community. "Aunt Margaret, look how our family has grown," Peter said one day, pointing to all the children playing in the schoolyard. "It's grown so much, my son, and it will grow even more," Margaret replied, smiling. Richard, now with white hair but a young heart, kept finding new ways to use his fortune to transform lives. He had created a scholarship fund, financed research in education, and supported dozens of social projects. "Mr. Richard, have you ever thought about writing a book telling our story?" Margaret suggested one afternoon. "Our story?" Richard asked. "The story of how an open safe changed 2 lives and transformed an entire community," Margaret explained. "Margaret, who would believe a story like that?" Richard asked, laughing. "Everyone who needs to believe there are still good people in the world," Margaret answered. "You're right. Maybe it's time to tell that story," Richard agreed. "But you have to tell the whole truth, okay? So even the part where I did think about taking a bill," Margaret insisted. "Especially that part, Margaret, because that's what makes you human and special at the same time," Richard replied. "And you have to say you're no saint either, that you tested other maids before me," Margaret continued. "Of course, the whole truth, no sugarcoating," Richard agreed. "And it has to end by explaining that money isn't bad. What's bad is what some people do with it," Margaret added. "Margaret, you always have the right words for everything," Richard admired. "It's because I've learned that the most important words are always the simplest," Margaret answered. That evening, as they watched the children playing and studying at the school they had built together, Margaret and Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey they had taken. It had all started with a test of honesty and turned into a life lesson about values, family, generosity, and purpose. The safe that had once been left open no longer mattered. What mattered were the hearts that had opened to love, the dreams that had become reality, and the lives that would keep being transformed for generations. "Mr. Richard, do you regret anything?" Margaret asked. "I regret taking so long to meet you and your family," Richard answered sincerely. "And I regret being afraid at first, afraid to accept your help, afraid to dream big," Margaret confessed. But in the end, it all worked out, didn't it? Richard smiled. It worked out more than fine. It worked out perfectly, Margaret agreed. And so, as the sun set behind the trees in the schoolyard, two people fate had brought together through an open safe, kept writing a story of hope, transformation, and love for others. The end. And what about you, dear listener? What did you think of this story of Margaret and Richard? Do you believe there are still people like Margaret in the world? And like Richard, would you use your wealth to transform lives? Share your thoughts in the comments and pass this story along to someone who needs to believe in human kindness. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.